Welcome again and good afternoon. My name is Amy and I'm the Public Programs Manager at the New York Transit Museum. If you haven't been to the museum, it's a very unique space and worth a visit. We are located in downtown Brooklyn in a decommissioned I&D subway station. You can actually see what our platform looks like with some of our vintage trains in my background. We are open now from Thursday to Sunday, 10 to 4 p.m. You can reserve tickets on our website. We also have a gallery and a shop in Grand Central Terminal. So for today's program, if you'd like captions, go to captions on the bottom of your screen or to the three dots, select captions and then show captions. So I'm very, very pleased to introduce today's presenter, Peter Lloyd. Peter began collecting subway maps in the 1990s. After working with the best-selling author Mark Ovenden on a book on the Paris Metro, he started researching the New York City subway map, which is available at the museum's online store. And I'm going to put a link into the chat. He also organized a major symposium on the map in 2015 at the Cooper Union. And in 2018, he published the results of a usability study of color for the MTA Weekender map at the University of Kent. He is currently writing further volumes on the map's history. So we will leave time for questions at the end of Peter's talk. Feel free to add them to the Q&A feature or the chat whenever, and then I will share them out to Peter at the end of the talk. Now I'll hand it over to Peter.
Thanks very much, Amy. So my name is Peter Lloyd, and I'm going to be talking about the historical use of color in the New York City subway map. We're all familiar with the use of colors in the map as it is now, but where do those colors come from? To understand that, we need to look at maps in the past, but there's a bewildering variety of different maps. And what I'm aiming to do in this talk is to put them into a narrative so you can see where we have come from and where we might be going in the color schemes of the New York City subway map. I'm going to start with a timeline. The subway opened in 1904 with the Interborough Rapid Transit, or IRT, followed 2 decades later with the Brooklyn Manhattan Transit, BMT, and 10 years after that, the Independent Subway System, the IND. In 1940, these were brought under one roof, but physically remained separate systems until 1967, when the Christie Street connection allowed the interworking of 2 of those networks, the BMT and the IND. Now, the IRT and the BMT were private companies, but the IND was run by the Board of Transportation for the City of New York, and after the unification, all 3 of them then became part of the Board of Transportation. 1953, the Transit Authority took over from the Board of Transportation, and then 68, the MTA, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, was created as a parent body above the Transit Authority. A little bit complicated, but I just thought it'd be good to plan out where we've come from in terms of organizations. Now, in terms of maps, the earliest maps, we know what they look like, but we don't know who designed them. 1924 onwards, pretty sure that John W. Grieve was the designer of these early IRT maps, not 100% sure. The BMT maps we know were done by George V. Plackey, and the 1932 onwards IND maps by Arthur Weindorf. After that, we have the Hagstrom era from 1943, when his maps were adopted as the official Board of Transportation maps. And for a short while, Stephen Voorhees was also used as an official map. 58, we've got George Salomon's map, and then Raleigh Adama's inspired route-colored map, followed by the very famous Massimo Vignelli map, and then John Tauranac's committee created the trunk-colored map, which is essentially what we have now. So I'm going to break this down into different eras. The first era is the 2-color map. This book was published in 1904 as a commemorative volume, not for sale to the public, but handed out to VIPs. And this contains the first colored subway map. Red was used for subways and blue for the elevated system run by the same company, which you can see here. Zoom into a section where we see the red subway crossing underneath the blue elevated line. To the north, we see that the subway tracks go onto a viaduct, actually are above ground, but still red because they're part of the subway system. We don't have much information about what maps were put on the station walls. We know that at least from 1914, there were subway maps on the station walls in the IRT system. Most likely they looked like this or very similar to this, where again, blue is for elevated, red is for subway, and this particular version removed all the street details, but it still labeled these stations by the streets. In 1923, the BMT system started, and the following year, they started making pocket maps of this type we see here by George Plackey. Now, again, the concept is above ground versus underground, but it's a little bit different here because there was no elevated system. What we have is the parts of the network that are above ground are shown in red. And obviously, bridges like Manhattan Bridge are red because they're above ground, whereas black indicates tunnels. And from 1924, also, the IRT started producing its own pocket maps in competition with the BMT, keeping to their scheme of red for the subways. And we can see that there's no convention here. So for the BMT, the subway lines are black. For the IRT, the subways are red. And in certain sections, we see that the tracks were used by both the subway trains and the elevated trains. And so there's this blocking pattern of red and blue. The third network, remember there are three networks, the IRT, BMT, and IND. The IND was much simpler and didn't at first use any color coding, just a single black line. But as the network became more busy, here we move from 1932 to 1934, there's an increasing need to clarify the routes that are running on these lines. And Arthur Weindorf devised this scheme in which each route is drawn separately. And I'll zoom in to show this. He uses a rule called no dot, no stop. If you look, for example, at 23rd Street, there are dots on two of the routes and not on the other two, meaning that the two routes that have a dot there will stop at 23rd Street. If there's no dot, it doesn't stop. There's no indication in the main part of the map as to which route is which. You have to look at the terminal. And here you can see in the top right corner, the A train and the C and C3 trains. So you've got to follow the line up to the terminal to find out which route it is. And there's also a key down in the bottom right-hand corner. Later that year, in 1938, Weindorf produced this map, which is printed on glass. This is a specimen in the Transit Museum. They seem to be extremely rare because they're glass. And if you zoom in, you can see the same pattern of no dot, no stop. But now each route has its own color, which clarifies considerably following these routes through the map. 1943, now this is a few years after the unification of the three networks, and Arthur Weindorf devised this sketch diagram of how he imagined the map moving forwards in time. So added in new routes and also routes that hadn't been built yet, but simply proposed. And his ideal was to extend this system of mapping to the entire network, not just the IND. He put two sketches forward to the Board of Transportation, as it was then, to suggest this would be a way forward for mapping the combined network of all three systems, the IND, IRT, and BMT. And it's a very ingenious scheme. You can see how it's evolving from the black and white to color and then to thinner color lines and a more complex map. But was he successful? No, he wasn't. To see what happened next, we go back in time a little bit to 1933. So we've got our three operating systems, IRT, BMT, and IND, each with their own separate style of mapping. Meanwhile, in the commercial sphere, Andrew Hagstrom, with his own private mapping company, has devised a map with all three networks on. So here we have a map with this color coding, the IND lines shown in red, IRT in blue, and the BMT initially in orange, later in yellow. So this was a map which couldn't have been done before unification because each of the operating companies was very proud of its own system and wouldn't allow other networks on their map. So the IRT map showed only IRT systems, and BMT map showed only BMT lines. Hagstrom saw an opportunity there and used it to produce this commercial map, which was sold in newsagents and used with promotional material for banks and hotels. And in 1943, the year of Weindorf's map, Weindorf's proposal, the Board of Transportation adopted this map as the official one. And you can see here how he uses color to separate out the different divisions as they were then of the system. Quick comparison of the early two color maps, IRT and BMT, then Weindorf's multicolor map and Hagstrom's three-color map. You see now that the elevated lines are shrunk down to a skinny little black line at the bottom. Now there's a question here of why did the Board of Transportation do this? Why did it adopt Andrew Hagstrom's commercial map rather than developing their own map from Arthur Weindorf, who worked for the Board of Transportation? Well, we don't know exactly because it's not documented, but I would make a guess that this is the reason. During World War II, Andrew Hagstrom did a lot of work for the US Navy, including making weather-resistant naval charts. And after the war, he got a $70,000 contract to install these melamine subway maps in every subway and elevated station in the system, very resistant to weather and to vandalism. And the following year, got a contract for maps of the same design in every subway car. So my guess is that back in 1943, the Board of Transportation were aware that these melamine maps were in the pipeline, they're going to be produced, and to allow for a consistent system of mapping in both pocket maps, station maps, and car maps, they awarded the contract in 1943 to Andrew Hagstrom to produce the car maps, sorry, the pocket maps, and not give the contract to develop Weindorf's map. So 1952, we move on because although Hagstrom had this monopoly position of dominating subway maps in the whole city, he had his own commercial maps, he had maps in the telephone directory, he had maps in every station, every car, every pocket. And the Board of Transportation was weary of being, quote, at the mercy and monopoly of a private map maker, in other words, Andrew Hagstrom. And the following year, the board was replaced by the Transit Authority, and then they started moving away from the Hagstrom map. They adopted Stephen Voorhees' map, which is very similar to Hagstrom, but it's printed with promotional material for the Union Dime Savings Bank and hence provided free of charge. Whereas the TA had to buy Hagstrom's map, they got it free from the Union Dime. So that was the start of the process of moving away from Hagstrom, and we're about to see how they moved completely away. So yeah, so this is the timeline. See Andrew Hagstrom, Stephen Voorhees, and then we get George Salomon. In a final break with the Hagstrom and Voorhees maps, the TA, Transit Authority, commissioned George Salomon to design a map that the TA would publish itself and have complete control over, rather than relying upon cooperation from an outside body. Now, Salomon was very much ahead of his time, and he proposed a comprehensive redesign of wayfinding signage, rather like Unimarks in the 60s, a diagrammatic map of the subway, like Vignelli's in the 70s, and a trunk-based color scheme, like the one we ended up with John Tauranac committee in the late 70s. How much of that did the Transit Authority accept? Well, let's see. In 55-56, Salomon submitted two long proposals to the Transit Authority, which are now housed in the museum archives. Now, in the second of these, Out of the Labyrinth, he proposed his trunk color scheme. So let's zoom into some details here. He proposed organizing the subway into 5 trunks going down Manhattan. I mean, they are physically trunks there, but the idea was to use those trunks as a way of classifying the routes. So he assigned a letter and a color to each of those 5 trunks. Now, this is a little bit faded, but the B and C are actually different shades of blue. D is orange, and then E is red, and the F is obviously green. Within each trunk, the branches will be labeled by numbers. So here we see the 7th Avenue, which is the red trunk, and he then labeled the branches going out north and south as 1 to 6. It's a very compact scheme, and this is a sample of his hand-drawn map using those 5 trunk colors. Did the Transit Authority accept this? No, it did not. Although it was a great idea, the cost and inconvenience of it probably put them off. So they did not adopt his comprehensive redesign of wayfinding signage using the trunk letters and the numbers. They did not accept his trunk-based color scheme, but they did accept the concept of a diagrammatic map. And that's what it looked like. And this used a 3-color scheme as Hagstrom had used before, but with different colors. So we see that the IND is still red, but the IRT has now moved from blue to black, and the BMT from orange or yellow to green. Why did he make such a big change? Why not simply use the colors as they were? I think it was to make the map more resistant to problems in printing. For example, in the yellow BMT line in Hagstrom, you had to draw black edging on either side of the line to make it clear where it was, because yellow doesn't stand out. To avoid that problem, Salomon had a solid green block for the line, for the BMT line. And we see here an example of how the printing methods affect the design of the map. Maps don't exist in a vacuum. They're influenced by social pressures and, as we see here, printing technology. And let's zooming in a little bit here to show how he uses the colors to separate out the divisions, and a quick comparison with Hagstrom's map of the same area. You also see he uses color to indicate transfer stations. So Times Square in Salomon's map on the right is shown by a white rectangle, whereas in Andrew Hagstrom's map on the left, he has a little black lasso around the station stops that make up the Times Square complex. Now, Salomon effectively launched 2 decades of diagrams, but the diagrams did not stay the same over the years. They changed. 61, the TA added little yellow circles to represent points of interest. And then in 1964, for the World's Fair, they added the big fat blue line going from Times Square up to the World's Fair station, which, by the way, George Salomon hated. We now move on to route colored maps, a big jump from those 3-color ones to multicolor ones. Why? Why did this happen? Well, in 1957, the TA started launching, opening up contracts to make a number of infrastructural changes to relieve congestion in the network. The one that's of interest to us here is a 2-mile tunnel under Christie Street in Chinatown. And let's see why this had a big impact on the map. Here's a plan of the tunnel. We can see that there's a red IND line curving round, and then 2 green BMT lines going across this area. And then highlighted in yellow, we see the Christie Street connection itself. This is the new tunnel that's built, and it connects the IND network with the BMT network, thereby allowing trains to interwork between the networks. For the first time, those 2 networks effectively became one. Why does this impact the map? Well, because the map is based on a color scheme of green and red for the BMT and IND. So what are we going to do with a tunnel that links them together? Is the Christie Street connection going to be green or red? And whichever color we choose, how does it make any sense in map reading if you're following a line and suddenly it jumps from a red to a green? I mean, does that mean that the entire combination of IND and BMT should be banded red and green, or choose a new color? It loses the ease of reading the significance of the colors once we have interworking between 2 of the 3 networks. So what was to be done? Well, the TA didn't know. So they organized a subway map contest. They invited members of the public to submit ideas for improved mapping of the subway. Now, they didn't mention the Christie Street connection. They just said, we need a better map, a clearer map. Please come forward with the ideas of how we should map the subway. They didn't say anything at all about the Christie Street connection and its impact because they were worried about resistance and people objecting to it, which when they did eventually release information, people did object and try to stop it by legal processes. So this competition ran in 1964. There were 3 winners: Ronnie D'Adamo, Harris Sheckman, and John and Mary Condon. The results from one of these was passed forward to Stanley Goldstein, professor at Hofstra University, namely the report that accompanied Raleigh's map. So each of the 3 winners produced a map, but Raleigh also produced a report explaining the principles used in his map. That went to Stanley Goldstein, who with his students produced another report and 4 prototype maps in more detail than the original. That then went to the Transit Authority. 2 of them were accepted by Jerome Adler in the Designs Division, and eventually went to Diamond International, who printed the map. And Dante Calise did the final design and color selection. We don't have those original maps anymore. The 3 contest maps we know were filed away for about 10 years and then discarded. The 4 prototype maps from Stanley Goldstein, we don't know what's happened to them. Probably they've been lost. They're missing, assumed lost. But we do have some information about the maps. Now, starting with Raleigh's map, luckily Raleigh has kept the sketches he kept when he was developing his map. Now, his big idea to solve the mapping problem was, why not draw each route, each end-to-end route, in its own separate color? And he developed the notion of blending the colors together where they run on the same tracks. Because part of the problem he faced is that the TA had indicated or demanded the maps in the contest must be geographically accurate. Now, the problem with Manhattan then is you have 14 different routes running down Manhattan, a very narrow island. There isn't enough room to physically draw in any clear way 14 different routes. So Raleigh's brilliant idea was, why not compress them by alternating bands of color? So here we see 2 routes, a yellow and a green. They merge together in one trunk where they're represented by alternate green and yellow bands, thereby not occupying twice the space. He expanded this concept to all the routes in the whole system. And here we can see some of them have got black, red, and yellow, and so on. And he did a lot of sketches, we've got 31 of them here, exploring the idea of how to develop a color coding scheme that avoids clashes. Because what you don't want is to have 2 routes of the same color going together on the same trunk, because then you wouldn't tell the difference between one color band and another color band. And on his daily commute from Manhattan up to Pleasantville, he would be sketching these possibilities, and eventually found a color scheme that did this, that enabled him to show each route in a separate color without any clashes. And that is what he then used in his final map. Now, for a long time, all we had to go on were these 2 press photographs of his map. And in the background, you see Harris Sheckman with his map, which didn't go forward to the TA, and also a black and white photocopy. It is difficult to work out from this what the color scheme was. Luckily, 50 years on from the contest, in 2014, Raleigh found in his basement a color photograph of his map. Now you can see more or less what it looks like. You can zoom into the key and see here how a yellow line has a red merged into it and a green line merged into that. But you can't see very much more detail than that. So I asked Rika Comley, my partner, to digitize this, to take the original photograph, study it carefully, and work out in a digital drawing package what the map originally looked like. And this is the result. I'll just zoom into the key first of all. You can see this is just like the key in the photograph, and zoom into mid-Manhattan. And here you can see, for example, in the Lexington Avenue, the local line is yellow and the express line is alternating orange and blue blocks. And for each of the trunks, each of the 5 trunks in Manhattan, we have the same pattern of express and local. On each of those lines, we have blocks of color indicating which of the end-to-end routes runs along that trunk. It's a brilliant scheme. It gives a huge amount of information and maintains the TA's requirement of it being geographically accurate. It's a little bit difficult to read, and we'll see how we move on from that presently. An addition which is required in this system is to indicate which color is which route. And he did this by means of route markers at the terminal. So here we see, for example, the 4 and 5, where they end, we have a little colored square with the number in, or we have letters. And this is the first use that I'm aware of these route markers. These later evolved into the famous Unimark colored discs, which you see everywhere, a color for each route with the number or letter inside it. This is where they first started. So what happened with the report? Remember that the map itself was never given to Stanley Goldstein. He never saw it. I asked him. It was filed away by the TA and eventually discarded, but Stanley did get the report, and that contained these 3 key elements that were used subsequently. First of all, color coding by route. So each route has its own color, fundamental point. Secondly, the use of these colored route markers that we just saw. Thirdly, the rule of no dot, no stop. I should have pointed this out. Let's just go back 1 second. So you can see up here, where there is a local stop, there's a dot, and where there isn't a dot, there's no stop. Here, for example, there's dots on either side, and that means it's an express stop, the express train stopping there, and the local one. That is the no dot, no stop rule. So that was contained in the report, and it's a very detailed report. For example, here's the description of the route markers. Route numbers and letters shall be shown at terminals as indicated by the design submitted herewith. Such route numbers or letters shall have a border of 1/16 inch thick and shall be the same color as the color of the line. You can tell from the languaging that Raleigh was a lawyer. Now, with that report in hand, Stanley then tried to develop his own maps. And one of the things he had to do was to work out a consistent color scheme. Remember, he didn't see Raleigh's map, because Raleigh had already drawn up those 31 sketches to work out a consistent pattern of colors. Goldstein didn't see that, so he had to do it himself. And he did that by taking colored wire and nailing it to a map of Manhattan and Brooklyn and Queens and the Bronx, and work out a pattern of colors using those wires that was consistent. The result were these 4 prototype maps, of which 2 of them were then used by the Transit Authority going forwards, and map 3 and map 4, we don't, as I said, have the original maps. One thing we do have are little excerpts inside the report. Let's zoom into these. On the left, we have his trunk color scheme. And in order to indicate which routes will stop at each station, he draws a little box. So here on the trunk going from the top left to the bottom right, S and L is nomenclature, indicate that the S route and the L route stop at each of these stations. Similarly, in the one going from bottom left to top right, we have another trunk where there are 2 routes on the same trunk, 2 and 4. And so you can tell from this where each route is going to stop. It's a slightly poor choice of area of the subway to use because there aren't any express stops, but this is the one in the report. On the right-hand side, we have a different version of the map. Here, this is map 4, where he uses a trunk color scheme. So here, route color scheme. So here, each route has its own color, and you can see that it doesn't make any difference on the one going from top left to bottom right, but it does make a difference in the one going from bottom left to top right, because here we have a single red line, whereas in the route color one, The black and the red, the 2 and the 4, are drawn separately. As I said, it would have been nicer if he'd chosen an area with some express stops. But anyway, you can imagine, for example, at Sutter Station, if that little white donut wasn't there, it would mean the black line didn't stop. So he is using the no dot, no stop rule in map 4. So he presented these two possibilities to the Transit Authority. We don't have the original maps. We do have this 35mm slide, which gives us a reasonable idea. You can see here that the colors correspond to individual trunks. And we can zoom in. It's a very grainy, it's a 35mm slide, but you can see the use of these boxes that represent which routes stop in each station. And here we can zoom into the particular area that corresponds to what was in the report around the Livonia station. And you can see we have little white boxes for the stations, and over on this route, slightly different color boxes for that trunk. So the TA gets both of these maps, 3 and 4, and it says, which one are we going to use for the final published map? Well, Len Ingalls, who's been supervising this thing from the beginning, he says, let's go for proposal 4. So that seems to be a final decision. He's the guy in charge of publicity, information, and community relations. But 3 days later, January 17th, 1966, Jerome Adler, who's chief of the designs division, says, well, okay, let's take proposal number 4, but let's mix it with proposal number 3. Let's meld them together. So it's going to be a route color map, as map 4 is, every route with its own color, but there will also be a box at each station listing the route stopping there. There's kind of redundancy in that because you've got the information about the routes from the color, and you've also got the information from the boxes. So although it's redundant, Jerome says, let's go with that. So they tell Diamond International, we're mixing maps 3 and 4, and Dante Calise, the designer at Diamond International, follows that. He produces the finished map in November 1967, which looks like this. And here's the key. You can see that each route has its own color. And this is zooming into the area around Times Square. You can see it's a very complex map. It's made complex by two things. First of all, these boxes at each station where they list all the routes. Secondly, by the use of broken lines for part-time services. So just going back a moment to the timelines here where we've got to. We've been through George Salomon and Raleigh Dadamo's proposal of route coloring leading to the 67 map. The next stop is Massimo Vignelli. Now, in response to the problems with the 67 map being so complex, and also following on from the Unimark signage program, in 1970, Massimo Vignelli signed a contract with the Transit Authority for a new subway map. And starting from the 67 map as its basis, Joan Charriston designed the new map under the design direction of Massimo Vignelli. That was the prototype given to the TA in 1970 to show what they were going to produce. And this is the final result, which we're all very familiar with, the famous Vignelli map. Now, although the design is completely different, it's much smoother, more elegant, the colors are essentially the same, which if you look carefully, you can see here, each line has got the same color in 72 as it did in 67. The only ones which do change are the shuttles. So here you can see the blue shuttle from Grand Central Terminal to Times Square, whereas in the Vignelli map, all the shuttles are green. But other than that, the colors are, some of the hues change, but basically the same color scheme that Dante Calise selected for Diamond International in 67. And here's the color key, 67, 72. You can see that all the colors are basically the same. Moving on from route colored maps, we go to the final section of trunk colored maps. Now, the Vignelli map wasn't long lasting. Just 2 years after it was introduced, The chairman of the MTA changed, William Ronan left, and David Unich came in. He was a senior executive at Macy's and brought with him concepts of marketing. He said that transit marketing is not too different from marketing shirts or automobiles. And he also talked about people-to-people programs that would include new maps for the public. So the idea is that the map is going to be used to market the subway. It's not just going to be a navigational aid for finding your way from A to B. It's going to make the subway look attractive. He brought with him from Macy's Fred Wilkinson, who we shall see was instrumental in replacing the Vignelli map. So here's a mini timeline just over this period of 74 to 1980, where a lot happened. So May 74, David Unich comes in as the new chairman of the MTA. November, Fred Wilkinson also comes in from Macy's. And in April the following year, Fred Wilkinson puts up a map of the New York subway system based very closely on the Hagstrom map. That was displayed not in public, but in the staff common room in the TA headquarters. A few months later, he started the Subway Map Committee, an organization designed to formulate a new map to replace the Vignelli diagram. Next month, he meets up with Michael Hertz, the graphic designer, head of Michael Hertz Associates, and in November, Michael Hertz Associates is engaged as a design firm. Now, we know that Fred Wilkinson was very keen on going back to the old three-color scheme. And in response to that, Michael Hertz wrote to him that this is his idea for how he's going to work, the designs for a geographic map discarding completely the current color coding system and using color primarily for delineating and separating the BMT, IND, and IRT routes. I realize that these designs are obsolete and that there are overlaps of service. However, the old nomenclature is still deeply ingrained in most New Yorkers, and this might be a viable approach. So his idea is to reject everything that happened from 67 onwards, get rid of all Vrana's idea of color coding, and go back to the old method that we saw in George Salomon of three colors for the three networks. The problem is that the Christie Street connection isn't going to go away. And here we see where it is. We've got the red IND line and the two green BMT lines. Remember, we saw these in the picture of the Christie Street connection, which is this line going down. And Hertz has drawn that in green, but it could equally well be red. This is the logical problem of this bridge between the IND and the BMT. How is it going to be represented on a map? Vrana Didama's idea is to do each route as a separate color, and that, as a byproduct, solves this problem, and Hertz wants to go back to it. So for about a year, a number of variants of this map were produced and tested, but they were not adopted. Meanwhile, and this is what is happening in the TA, the Transit Authority in J Street. Meanwhile, over in the MTA, they've hired John Tauranac, an English major, to write this book. This is a guidebook to New York, encouraging people to use the subway to travel around. It's designed for the bicentennial in 1976, when they expected a large number of people to visit New York. And this had a radically new approach to mapping the subway. Each line will be represented by red, but the routes be indicated by these colored route markers. It's a little bit difficult to follow because all the lines are the same, but all the information is there, but you have to look at the route markers to follow it. The other thing is it's a very strict geographic map, and therefore it takes 21 pages of the guidebook to cover the whole of New York. Not realistic for putting a map on the wall or in your pocket. Nevertheless, so in 1977, John Tauranac becomes the chair of the committee, and shortly afterwards, Michael Hertz Associates hires Nobuyuki Sorese, an artist and graphic designer, as the art director of the subway map project under the auspices of the committee. And in the first year, Nobuyu's huge contribution is to deform New York. to squeeze the whole of the city into this square. So here we see Manhattan has been flattened out, Brooklyn's been twisted around, and it enables us, instead of having 21 pages of a map, it's all on one sheet. The map itself still uses Tauranac's red line. All the lines are the same, but the routes are indicated by color bullets. That is exhibited to the public in February 1978 in the City Island Gallery run by Ben Blom. And the response from the public is, yeah, we love the geography. We love seeing where the subway is in the bigger city, but we don't like all these red colors. It's confusing to have all the lines the same. The map was also exhibited in the AIGA exhibition at roughly the same time that horrified the design community and led to the Cooper Union debate, where Massimo Vignelli and John Tauranac went head to head. Now, for that debate, a map was exhibited in the foyer, not the red line map, but a red and blue line map. So what's happened here is that Nobu has taken a blue tape and covered over the IRT line. So if we zoom in here, you can see that the design of it is the same, the topology is the same, and the IND and BMT are both still red, but now we've got two colors. We've got blue for the IRT. And this is feasible because it's the IND and BMT, remember, that were merged together under Christie Street, whereas the IRT is still separate. But it's still not much clearer. It's not ideal. It's a bodge. What will happen next is unexpected. The MTA founds the Aesthetics Committee, and Phyllis Surf Wagner is the chair. She goes to John Tauranac and says, and her main role was to beautify stations, to repaint them and make them look nice. But as part of that program of beautification, she goes to John Tauranac and says, how are you getting on with this subway map? And John says, we're dead in the water. We can't progress because we're stuck with either a red color map or red and blue. What we really want is a trunk color scheme. Just like George Salomon has said, each of the 5 trunks should have its own color. And Phyllis said, well, can you give me an example of this? So over the Labor holiday weekend, John asked Nobu to draw up some sketches of the possibilities. And this is one of the sketches that Nobu Ceresi did. So what he's done is to devise a scheme of colors where each trunk has its own color and the branches from it go out into the same color. So here, for example, you see a green branching out, and then over here, that's the Lexington Avenue is red at this point, branching off, and all the branches have got the same color. And we zoom in and we can see how Nobu has done this. This is a proof of concept. It shows that it is possible to draw the subway system with those 5 colors. George Salomon had done this before back in the 50s, but that had been filed away somewhere. The Tauranac committee didn't see George Salomon's report. And so this is reinventing the wheel, as it were. This concept went forward up the hierarchy in the TA, and the MTA was approved in the same day, and that was that. That sealed the fate of the Vignelli map, because we now had a geographically accurate or semi-accurate, pseudo-accurate map outline, and we had a color scheme. The only remaining thing was to work out exactly which colors to use. Now, Nobu had his own idea of what the colors should be, and this is one of his sketches from late 78. And you can see, for example, that Lexington Avenue is red, and other colors are different from what they are now. So the question then was, and that's a detail from his sketch, the question is, what color should be the final one? John Tauranac didn't really mind which color it was, but somebody else did mind. Now, this piece of paper I came across in a folder labeled Miscellaneous in the Transit Museum archives, and I was amazed and delighted to find it, because this is what I call the Rosetta Stone of subway colors. It shows the interconnection of the old colors, proposed colors, and the final colors. Let's dig into this and see what it tells us. Now, first of all, the color labeled Unimark, these are the colors that were currently in use on the Vignelli map, And over here on the left, we have Nobuaki Sorese's colors. So these are the ones used in that sketch that I showed you, listed down here. So that was his proposal of a color scheme. Then we have the proposal from Len Ingalls. Now he saw Nobu's scheme and said, no way, Jose, that is too expensive, because whenever you change the color of the line, it's not just changing the map, you have to change all the signage in the stations and change all the signage on the cars. It all has to be a consistent scheme of color coding, map, station, and car. And Len said, if you follow Nobu's scheme, you've got to change a lot of stations and it's going to be very expensive. So he proposed this second column. And then thirdly, John Tauranac, the chair of the committee, adopted almost all of Len's suggestions except for one pair, which we'll examine in a moment. And what Len Ingalls had suggested is that in each, and this is very clever, in each trunk, we select what he called the flagship route, the route that's got the most stations. So let's go down to the bottom and look at 7th Avenue. The route that's got the most stations out of those 3 routes on that trunk is 2, the 2 train. And so let's adopt the color of the 2 train, which is red, as the color of the trunk. That way, we minimize the number of stations we've got to change. Whereas Nobu had said, well, let's have blue because it looked nice. But Len said, no, economics overrides aesthetics. It'll be red because that is the longest route. And the other 2, the 1 and the 3, will comply with the color of the number 2 train. And we can see that in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of the trunks, that's exactly what's happened. Len has chosen the color that is the longest one, and that was then adopted. Now, you'll notice that in the 6th Avenue, John Tauranac has changed the color choice. Likewise in Flushing, he has swapped them around. So if we look into these 2 particular lines, for the 6th Avenue, Len Ingalls suggested purple because that was the longest line on the 6th Avenue trunk, and John changed it to orange. Meanwhile, on the 7th Avenue, sorry, the number 7 train, which is only 1 line, Len said, let's just stay with orange because the line's already orange. It was orange in the Vignelli map, so why not keep it orange? And John said, no, let's make it purple, swapping it with 6th Avenue. Why? Why did he do that? Well, because a lot of the 6th Avenue branches, the BD and F trains, spend a lot of their time running alongside blue routes. And we see here on the right what the map would have looked like if Len Ingalls had his way. We've got the BD and F as purple, and they're very close to a blue line, and it's not very clear. John said, no, let's use orange for the 6th Avenue trunk, for the BD and F. And then you've got double, numerically speaking, double the distance of the colors. So it's clearer. So that explains those 2 anomalies. Now, the other thing to bear in mind to understand the remaining anomalies is that there were more colors. The Vignelli map had been printed with 8 colors. It went through the printing press twice. The new map is going to go through 3 times. So there were 12 colors. That means you've got 4 extra colors to play with. One of these colors was assigned to the new route, JFK Express. That's the sky blue one. Brown was another new color. There's no brown in the Vignelli map. So if we're going to use this color as a way of separating out the routes, it's going to mean we're changing the color of one of the trunks to brown. And then Ingalls said, well, let's just choose the Nassau Street line, J&M, and let's give the brown to them because it's a very short line, 58 station stops, and that's why they became brown. And then lime green was another color, but that was assigned to GG, which was already a kind of green. And also black was now used as a line color assigned to the shuttle. Vignelli had them all green. Len said, let's make them all black because the shuttles aren't that interested. shuttles don't interact much with other routes. So let's give them black. It's a nice compact color. Now I mentioned there were 12 colors. What was that covers 3 of them, lime green, brown, and sky blue. Black was always there. What was the 4th color used for? It wasn't assigned to any route. It was used in the bodies of water in the background. So that is the long answer to the simple question of why were the colors as we see them here. So there is an explanation for each one. Most of them are chosen because of the longest route and therefore the cheapest to change, but some of them were chosen for other reasons. And this is then the final map published in June 1979, using the colors that were selected by Len and John Tauranac interacting. We zoom in and we see again how these colors are used to separate out the trunks, and that then becomes the foundation for the map that we still see in the station now. The map has been redrawn many times, but the color coding concept is still the same. So just to quickly sum up in the timeline, we started off with 2 color maps, subway and elevated, and a little bit of route coloring with Weindorf's experimental map. Then we had the 3 color maps, BMT, IND, and IRT. Then Ronald Adamo said, well, let's color each route separately. And then finally, John said, no, let's just color them by the trunks. And that is the end of talk. This is part of an ongoing project to document the history of the subway map. I'm reliant upon information from a lot of people, and I just want to say thanks to all these people who've contributed, first of all, to this presentation and many more who have been helping me with this whole project of documenting the subway map history. That's the end. Thank you very much for your attention. Over to you, Amy.
Thank you so much, Peter. That was amazing. I'm not sure if you get a chance to look at the chat now. You're getting a lot of bravos and thank yous and a lot. So there's been a lot of questions in the chat. Been trying to keep track of when they've been answered by someone else in the chat or when you have answered it in your presentation. So if I repeat something, sorry, everyone, but I'll just get started and we'll try to answer as many questions as we can. But again, if you have more, please add them either to the chat or the Q&A function. Okay, so these also are in order in how we receive them, so they kind of follow the order of your presentation. So there's a few questions in the beginning about sharing tracks between the 3 divisions. So who decided who got to use which tracks when, and how did track usage work in stations when IRT cars are narrower?
Well, they built their own tracks. So after the IRT had been built and was established, the BMT developed its own tracks, built separately under the so-called 2 contracts. And then later on, the IND was built by the Board of Transportation quite separately. So nobody decided that a certain track would be assigned to a particular division. The original railroad companies built their own tracks. Okay.
Do you have any maps from the BMT's predecessor, the BRT, the Brooklyn Rapid Transit?
I do. I haven't mentioned it here because I wanted to focus specifically on the color coding of the subway system. And so I decided to start with the BMT in 1923. I don't think color coding came into any of the old BRT maps.
Got it. There was a couple interesting comments about the use of color and accessibility matters, like high contrast. Was that something that the designers took into an account?
Yes, not until the 70s. Michael Hirst arranged with Nobis Ceresi, the art director, to consult with specialists in color vision to try to choose colors that were more contrasting. Obviously, also limited by printing considerations, but yes, that was factored in the 70s.
Got it. Okay. So for the 1964 contest, were the winners all professional designer? Was the contest geared to having professionals enter, or were members of the general public invited to participate?
Members of the general public were invited. only one of the three winners, the John and Mary Condon team, were professional designers, and they were actually a little bit upset by the fact that the other two winners, and in particular Raleigh, who went forward, were, in their view, amateurs. Raleigh was a lawyer by profession, but also a transit enthusiast. Harry Sheckman was very young, like 17 at the time, and also a transit enthusiast. And their love of the subway system and their deep knowledge of it was what informed their contribution to the contest. Neither of them were cartographers or designers, but they still had great ideas. And the same thing happened in the 70s with John Tauranac, who wasn't a map maker, wasn't a designer. He was an English major, but he had a passion for New York. He's written a lot about the architecture and history of New York, and that informed his ideas about what the map should look like.
Okay, great. So the next there's a bunch of conversation in the chat about the influence of Mondrian and modernism on map making, especially I think with Raleigh's map. So I didn't know if you any comments on that, or I also, here's a link for everyone of the Mondrian I was thinking of at the MoMA, the Broadway Boogie Woogie of Mondrian, because it looks a lot like.
Yeah, George Salomon certainly was influenced. He arrived in New York in the same year as Mondrian, and he loved going to the Museum of Modern Art and looking at modern art pictures. In this aspect, he did love the Mondrian pictures. It didn't directly influence his design of the map in 1958, but it was kind of there in the background, the use of color and the use of simplicity. As to whether Raleigh was ever influenced by Mondrian, I don't think so, but it's a question we can put to him.
Okay, great. So there's also a lot of questions about the influence and maybe info sharing between the New York City designers of the maps and then other map designers in other countries, especially in London. It's more to say the question specifically, did anyone look at the London tube maps? We're using different colors for the different lines. Did they develop in tandem? And someone had mentioned that London arguably had trunk coloring from the early 20th century.
Yes, absolutely. George Salomon, as an emigre from Germany, spent about a year or so in England studying under Eric Gill, and obviously visited London, and was amazed and delighted by the London system. The signage and the map all seemed to be incredibly clear. When he came to New York, he was horrified that the signage was so confusing. People relied upon oral culture to find their way around. If you wanted to get somewhere, you asked somebody. You didn't look at a map because the maps were all, well, first of all, they were divided between the different railroad companies. And so George Salomon brought with him the idea of making New York, bringing it up to the level of the London signage and mapping systems. So he regarded the London Tube map as being the cartographic equivalent of the Sistine Chapel. It was the best possible way of mapping a transit system. And in his proposal, which is there in the archives, he wanted to totally rework the system in New York, the signage and everything, to bring it to that level of clarity. Unfortunately, all he got to do was the diagram. So yes, that first diagram map, George Salomon's in 1958, is directly influenced by the London map. Now, subsequently, people have argued that maybe Vignelli was influenced by London. He said not. He said he never looked at it. He just worked out the solution from first principles. Well, maybe. John Tauranac did bring some concepts from London, in particular the transfer symbolism, which has changed a bit since '79, but initially the white bridge between the white discs in that map were derived from the London system. I think we can quickly go back to that. Let me just whiz up there. Yeah, this kind of thing. Hopefully you can still see this. So here we can see these so-called white bridges. So you have a white disc for the station stop and then a white bridge to the others. That is directly taken by John Tauranac from the London map. So that is one of the ways in which London did influence the New York map. Sorry, that's a long answer.
No, that was great. So is there a publicly available version of the digitized Diadamo map?
There was a number of, well, in terms of printed paper ones, a number of posters were printed back in 2015 and were on sale in the Transit Museum shop. I don't know whether any's still there. The digitized version isn't for sale. If there was a demand, then we could do that. If someone wants to contact me, we can. Well, I mean, Reka Comley was the creator of that particular digitalization, so we can see if something can be arranged. But it's not for sale generally at the moment.
Okay, great. So someone talked about, so in the 70s, the history was pretty much bankrupt. How did that impact map planning? I mean, I know it impacted the subways a lot for sure, but how about the maps?
It delayed the creation of the new trunk cover map. Back in 75, the city was almost bankrupt, and the Transit Authority was laying off staff. It was deferring maintenance. There was no way that money could be available to change the colors of the subway. That would be ridiculous. There are far more important things to do. But in 1978, the federal government made a lot of money available to the city of New York, and some of that went to the MTA. And that was the point at which, and quite fortuitous in terms of timing, that Phyllis Surf Wagner was able to grab some of that money and steer it in the direction of paying for the change of signage. Because changing the map doesn't cost anything. The maps are reprinted all the time every year. But to change the color on the map, that requires changing the color on the station and in the cars to match the map. And that money suddenly became available in 1978. It wasn't available before then. And the timing again is crucial because the aesthetics committee with Phyllis Surf Wagner only lasted about 18 months before it was disbanded. So it was fortuitous that the subway map committee's development came to a head the same time that Phyllis was there with the aesthetics committee at the same time money was available. That coincidence made it possible for the new map to come into existence.
Okay, great. I'm going to keep going. So we're a little over the hour, but I think that's fine. So has it been explained why they chose letters to represent the train lines to this day? A, B, C, D, etc. Makes sense, but then why BDFM and QRW? Any idea? Not really
No,
a color question, but
yeah, I don't know. I mean, that goes back to the early BMT days because the IoT had numbers starting from 1 and moving forwards. The BMT and the IND chose letters. Why they didn't? Yeah, I mean, some kind of like letter I obviously doesn't get used because it looks like a 1, and letter O isn't appropriate, it looks like 0. But they kind of started from the beginning of the alphabet and worked forwards. And at one point, the IND had the double letter scheme, where single letter was the express service and double letter was the local service. And then you started getting permutations like QB and for the bridge. It started becoming very complicated. Yeah, so I think it was driven just by the alphabet starts with A and move forwards.
okay. So some people, I mean, other than your book, obviously, is there any book or future publication that details much of the same information as your presentation?
Not yet.
Not yet.
I'm working on 9 volumes to cover the entire history of the New York subway map.
Right.
It's a slow process. The next book is going to be the one covering 1972 to 79, the John Tauranac committee work. There's a lot of information is available still on that. And because there is so much information, it's a lot of work to compile. Whereas my previous volume on the Vignelli map is a bit shorter because there's not so much information. When the Unimark office closed in 71, a lot of material was lost. It was just binned. People didn't really think about what future historians might want. So we don't know that much about the process of creating the Vignelli map. I know that Joan Charlison was very much involved in the design, but we don't have any intermediate sketches. We don't have any memos of meetings as we do for the 79 one. So the work on the book for the Tauranac committee is a bigger book, takes more time. And I apologize. I know some people have actually pre-ordered it, and thank you very much. And I apologize that I haven't finished it yet. But yes, so those books are in the pipeline.
I didn't realize that we could pre-order it, so you'll have to share that link and we'll share that
I've
afterwards.
stopped taking pre-orders because it's just taken so long, but a
Okay.
group of people, because I ran a Kickstarter back in 2015. Anyway, that's a different story. The other book that you ought to read is Paul Shaw's book on signage, the story of the Helvetica. That is a brilliant book. Doesn't say, well, the first edition does include bits on the map. Second edition gives immense detail on the signage and the use of the Helvetica font. So if you're interested in part of the story, definitely read that book. And as regards Unimark, Jan Conrady's book on Unimark would be highly recommended.
Those are great recommendations. I'll try to send those out later as well, share those out later. Okay, so did the color used on the maps affect the colors on the route signs in the trains and the stations?
Yeah, they had to fit it together, otherwise people get confused. You couldn't look on the map for the blue line and then go to a station and it's some other color. So yes, the colors on the cars and on the stations had to match what was in the on the map.
Okay, great. We had a couple of follow-up questions about the accessibility of colors. So to drill down a little more specifically, for blind or low vision subway riders, is there a braille vision, and was colorblind individuals ever considered? Do you have any idea?
Yeah, as I said, Michael Hertz Associates did contact experts in
Right.
color visibility to try to choose colors which were more readily accessible. Part of the problem, though, was that, as we saw, Len Ingalls wanted to choose colors that were already in use to avoid the cost of relabeling everything. So there was a bit of a compromise between what could be changed without incurring extra cost and what couldn't be changed, it had to be stayed. So there was a compromise there. Braille, there are some, I've seen some signs in the subway system of Braille. I don't know if there's ever a Braille map. There might have been, but yes, there are certainly in some stations Braille signs.
Okay. Could you address the distinction between map, the NYC guide, and a functional diagram?
No, because all maps are diagrams. A map, even if it's geographically accurate, it still involves symbolism. The map has a code for representing on a piece of paper what is out there in reality. If you draw a line of a subway track, it's much thicker on the page, on the map, than it is in reality. So as soon as you start drawing a map of any kind, you're starting to move away from reality into essentially a diagram, a representation by symbolic means of what is in reality. And there's a continuum. So you can move away from having all the streets on the map, making it more abstract, as we saw actually in the early maps in 1904. There's already that abstraction of removing the streets. You can simplify the lines, straighten them out where it actually wiggles. You can deform the landscape. So the Tauranac map, the current map, is often regarded as geographic. It's actually pseudo-geographic because Manhattan isn't that fat. So in a way, you're already using symbolism in making it diagrammatic as soon as you distort the map at all. So there's a continuum, I believe, from pure geography through to very abstract maps. And the Vignelli map wasn't the most abstract by any means. There were proposals that Vignelli had for Washington, which were totally abstract, no geography whatsoever. So I don't think there is a hard and fast distinction between georealistic maps and diagrams. There's a continuum.
Okay, great. So I think we have time for a couple more. Someone noticed on the maps, 1938 and prior, maybe a little later, the current queue line ends at Church Avenue. Do you know why the stations south of that weren't shown? For example, Avenue H was in use from approximately 1905.
No, I don't know. It's an interesting question. Sorry, I don't know the answer.
All right. Okay, so someone I think just wanted clarification. So the Hertz map and the Vignelli diagram existed at the same time, or did the Hertz map make its debut after NYC rejected the Vignelli diagram?
No, they were separate. So the Vignelli map continued to be produced from 1972 to 1978. And then the new geographic map from the Tauranac Committee came into use in June 79. So there was no overlap between the two.
Okay, and I think for a final question, was there anything about the current map that you would change and why?
No, I steer away from any advice on designing maps. I'm just a historian. I just record what's happened. It's a huge minefield of how to design maps, and lots of people are making amateur maps, and they're very creative and interesting. And I know the MTA have got their own concepts of where they want to go with. I know that they have to bring in a lot of different factors, and this is one of the advantages of being an amateur designer. You don't have to worry about all the different stakeholders of the system. You just design a map that you think looks nice. The MTA have to take on board people who want to make bus connections and so on. So no, I'm not going to advise anybody how to draw a map.
I think that's probably wise. So anyway, thank you so much, Peter. This was really great. And thank you all again for joining us today. And we'd love to see you at the museum if you're in town. Again, here's the link to our website to get tickets. And if you enjoyed the program, please consider making a donation or becoming a member to help keep our programs going. And we also hope you join us for our next virtual event, which you can find on our website. I'll drop the link in the chat. It's going to be a drink and draw based on inspiration from objects in our collection with Sarah Nisbet, 6 p.m. next Thursday. And we'd also like to thank our sponsor, Con Ed, for supporting our virtual programs. Thank you again, and I hope everyone has a great weekend.
Thank you very much, Amy, and thank you everyone for coming along.